Canada could be on the verge of splitting in two. And no, this time it's not about Quebec. The new focus of tension lies in the west of the country, in a vast, rich province of incalculable geopolitical importance, but one that feels increasingly distant from the country to which it belongs. It's called Alberta, and it turns out separatists in the region are already negotiating with Washington to leave Canada and become the 51st state of the US.
Trump officials discussed $500 million Alberta independence loan. Private details from a Washington, D.C. meeting about Alberta becoming the 51st state were revealed at a separatism event attended by Dismog.
And you're probably wondering, but what is Alberta? Since when has a province like this wanted to secede from Canada? And why is the US so interested in it? This is unusual, because if there's one region that comes to mind when we talk about independence in Canada, it's Quebec, a province with its own language, a distinct culture, and a long history of clashes with Ottawa. But Alberta is different. It has no language of its own, no distinct colonial roots, and yet it's pushing the country toward a possible national breakup. Why? Because Alberta is not just any province. But first, let me ask you this. Getting rich in 2025 is actually way simpler than most people think. You don't need years of experience or a degree that leaves you in debt. In fact, with AI, you could start earning in just a few weeks, whether it's landing a high-paying job or launching something of your own. And here's the reality. Nearly every job today demands AI skills. People who know how to use AI are 130% more likely to land better opportunities. But don't worry, I've got good news for you. This weekend, you can join the 2-day AI Mastermind workshop by Outskill, the world's first AI-focused education platform. In just 16 hours, with expert mentors, Outskill learners have already built and launched 100+ AI products with zero coding, many generating $4 to $5K in revenue. Normally, this program costs $895, but we've partnered with Outskill to give away 1,000 free seats exclusively to our viewers, only for the next 72 hours. That's nearly $900,000 worth of training, completely free. And by the way, it's rated 4.9 out of 5 on Trustpilot. Why does this workshop stand out? Short and effective. Just 16 hours. Great for busy schedules. Lifetime access to Outskill's exclusive AI community. 5,000 plus members. A seamless AI learning dashboard. Already trusted by 10 million plus learners worldwide. Over the 2 days, you'll dive into prompt engineering, 10 plus powerful AI tools, automating your workflows, and building AI products without code. Also, if you sign up now, you get exclusive bonuses worth $5,100, a prompt Bible with 3,000 plus high-impact prompts on day 1, a roadmap to monetize AI on day 2, a personalized AI toolkit builder only if you attend both days. So, clear your weekend, Saturday and Sunday, 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. EST. Seats are limited and filling up fast. Grab yours through the link in the description. P.S. Join the WhatsApp group to stay updated before the big launch. And now, back to our topic. It has only 4.7 million inhabitants, but it accounts for more than 80% of Canada's oil. And most impressively, almost 70% of that oil goes directly to the United States. In fact, Alberta has much stronger economic ties with its American neighbors than with Canadians. It sells more to the United States than to all other Canadian provinces combined. And that link with the United States is no longer just economic, it's also political and increasingly ideological. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has made her position clear: more oil, less federal intervention. She shares with Donald Trump an aggressive energy vision focused on extraction and far removed from Canadian environmental policies. I'm sure you've all heard the Republican slogan, "Drill, baby, drill." Well, that oil industry battle cry could easily be the government's slogan in Alberta, and it's not just rhetoric. Smith has personally met with Trump at Mar-a-Lago.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith visits Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Premier says she had friendly and constructive conversation with U.S. President-elect.
There, they discussed joint projects, including the possible construction of a new oil pipeline. Meanwhile, Smith openly attacks the Canadian government's climate agenda, rejects environmental restrictions, and refuses to accept that Ottawa has any authority over her province's natural resources. In fact, they've gone so far as to create the Alberta Sovereignty Act, a law that limits the application of federal regulations and directly challenges the central government. The result? Tension that grows day by day, and with it, an idea that until recently seemed unthinkable: independence and joining their southern neighbor as the 51st state. But before that happens, Alberta would have to become independent. And let's get to the important question: do Alberta citizens really want independence? Well, according to some polls, everything indicates that they most likely do. In fact, there are polls that show that the yes to independence is more or less equal with the no.
Mark Carney faces a separatist push in Canada's oil-rich West.
Not only that, everything indicates that an official referendum will be held in 2026. But if Alberta leaves, the problem doesn't end there. It could trigger a chain reaction of fragmentation. Think about it. In a country that has already seen several attempts at independence, and which is experiencing economic stagnation and deep political disillusionment, such a blow could trigger the total breakup of Canada. Because if Alberta manages to leave, who would stop Quebec from trying again? Or other provinces that have also been experiencing tensions with the central government for some time? Canada is a federation held together by fragile agreements, and Alberta is beginning to break them. So what are the chances that Alberta will ultimately become independent? Where does the independence movement come from? And will it become the 51st state of the US? Let's break it down. For years, tensions between Alberta and Ottawa were there, latent, contained, like a pressure cooker. Yes, there were voices calling for more autonomy, more power for the province, but nothing that would tear the country apart. That was until 19th of October, 2015. On that day, the federal elections ended nearly a decade of conservative governments in Canada and ushered in a new era that no one in Alberta was going to welcome with open arms. Just look at the 2015 electoral map to get an idea. Alberta, completely conservative blue. The rest of the country, social democrat red and orange. A map split in two that made one thing clear. Alberta was politically alone. And yet, Justin Trudeau won with an absolute majority. So why did this hurt so much in Alberta? Because they knew what was coming. The Liberal Party, which, keep in mind, is not liberal in the Malay style, but liberal in the woke North American sense, had a very clear roadmap, an aggressive climate agenda, with much tougher environmental requirements for approving energy projects. The result? Any expansion of the sector was put on hold, investments slowed down, and every new infrastructure project became a bureaucratic maze. But if you thought that was the end of it, you would be wrong. Because the goal was not just to slow down the expansion of gas and oil, the plan was to dismantle it piece by piece. For example, in 2016, they cancelled the Northern Gateway Pipeline. This was a project that the Conservatives had already approved and that promised to connect Alberta's oil fields to the Pacific coast. The idea? To sell oil directly to giants such as China and Japan. Its cancellation not only meant the loss of billions in investments, it also ended what was perhaps the best way for Alberta to stop depending almost 100% on the US market. And then came the carbon taxes.
Canada imposes carbon tax on 4 provinces with no climate plans.
A new obstacle that only added fuel to the fire in a sector already suffocated by restrictions and uncertainty. But Trudeau did not come alone with a climate plan. He also brought with him a project to redistribute wealth among provinces. The idea was clear. The richest provinces, such as Alberta, would put more money on the table to help those with fewer resources. The instrument was the famous fiscal equalization formula. The money allocated to balance differences jumped from $18.3 billion in 2017 to 2018 to $22.1 billion in 2022 to 2023. In 2025, Alberta remains one of the only provinces that sends much more money to Ottawa than it receives in return. Each person in Alberta receives about $1,300 in federal transfers, including health and social services. But at the same time, they pay approximately $5,820 in federal taxes. This means that on average, they contribute over $4,500 net per year to the federal government. In other words, a family of 4 ends up paying around $18,000 in taxes that go to other provinces. To put this into perspective, other independence movements around the world, such as that in Catalonia, use a similar argument with phrases such as "Spain is robbing us," pointing out that each Catalan contributes a tax surplus of the equivalent of $1,400 per person to other parts of Spain, a quarter that of Albertans. But the story did not end there. Since 2014, Alberta has suffered another devastating blow, the fall in oil prices. And you know what happens when crude oil prices plummet in an interdependent region. At the same time, the rest of Canada was not in a celebratory mood either. Since 2011, GDP per capita has stagnated, and it was in this climate of frustration that, in 2022, one figure emerged who changed everything: Danielle Smith. a conservative, staunch defender of the energy sector and a clear voice against Ottawa's interference. Smith took control of the United Conservative Party and shortly thereafter became Premier of Alberta. Her message was straightforward: regain control of the province, protect its natural resources, and stand up to the federal government. And she wasted no time in turning words into action. Her challenge was crystallized in the controversial Alberta Sovereignty Act mentioned earlier. With Danielle Smith, Alberta entered a new phase of open confrontation with Ottawa. Let's be honest, this conflict between the federal and provincial governments, between rival political parties, should not come as such a surprise. After all, in every country, there are tensions, tugs of war, and escalations. But here, Donald Trump has proved to be the final straw. How? By completely changing the outcome of the 2025 general election.
Mark Carney's Liberals win pivotal Canadian election.
I don't know if you remember, but in early 2025, Canada had had enough of Trudeau and the left. Everything pointed to a comfortable victory for the Conservative Party. After all, with all the years of wearing down, the Liberal government seemed to be sinking. But then Trump came along, and with his inflammatory statements, what seemed like a sure victory for the Canadian Conservatives collapsed within a matter of days. Just look at the political polls projection chart. As the US Republican government progressed, voting intentions in Canada shifted back to the left. And the fact is, there's not much you can do when your political rival gets electoral ammunition with phrases like this.
I'll be calling our great American hockey team this morning to spur them on towards victory tonight against Canada, which with far lower taxes and much stronger security, will someday, maybe soon, become our cherished and very important 51st state.
The re-election of the Liberal candidate in Ottawa was a blow to Alberta. Once again, a government that seems to be working against the province with tough climate policies and a plan to redistribute wealth. But pay attention, because there are important nuances here. Mark Carney is not Trudeau, and even though he is from the same party, he has prepared important changes to try to calm things down a bit in Alberta. For instance, he has eliminated the carbon tax. He's also signalled his willingness to relax some rules to give the oil industry some breathing room, and he's even liberalised trade between Canadian provinces. Even so, Alberta's separatists do not trust him one bit, nor do they believe that these measures are sufficient.
Smith pointed to a novelty button on her desk that flashes red and lights up the word bullshit. This is what I press when I am on Zoom calls with the Liberals.
But that's not all, because on top of this, there is the tariff war. And why are they so decisive? Because Alberta is practically connected to the United States. Almost 70% of its oil crosses the border, and no less than 21% of the province's GDP depends on that industry. If Washington decides to raise tariffs or put in place new trade barriers, Alberta would be left hanging in the balance. And remember, we're not just talking about oil, which would be enough to shake things up, but also transportation, manufacturing, services, absolutely everything. Every corner of Alberta's economy is bound hand and foot to the US market. The consequence, one simple tariff could completely change the rules of the game on both sides of the border. And in the midst of this delicate chessboard, Danielle Smith appears making her move. She's not shouting it from the rooftops yet, but her nod to independence is becoming increasingly evident. The proof is in the numbers. Just one day after Mark Carney won the national election in April, Smith introduced a bill that radically lowers the bar for calling an independence referendum. Previously, some 600,000 signatures were required. Now, under the new rule, 1,777,000 are enough. In other words, starting next month, any citizen movement with a little organization could launch a vote to decide whether Alberta should break away from Canada. And would that be legal? Well, that's where the Supreme Court comes in. In 1998, in the historic case of Quebec's secession, the judges were crystal clear.
A clear majority on a clear question creates a duty to negotiate, but unilateral secession would be unconstitutional.
So yes, legally it would not be that simple, but politically, that's another story. Canada has already had several referendums on independence, and although the process is complex, it would not be impossible for a binding referendum to be granted, especially if the yes vote wins decisively in 2026. But obviously, with all this on the table, the big issue is the writing is on the wall. Yes, we are looking at a real threat. The numbers confirm it. Several polls already show that independence is not a marginal whim. Although the majority still doesn't consider secession a winner, there is one fact that cannot be ignored. At least 30% of Albertans want to break away from Canada. Now then, only 30%? Doesn't that sound too small a number to make such a fuss? Actually, no. Firstly, because polls are never a crystal ball. And secondly, because on such polarizing issues, public opinion can swing 180 degrees within a matter of weeks. Do you want an example? Brexit. When serious talk of a referendum began between 2013 and 2015, remaining in the European Union seemed a foregone conclusion. In 2014, for instance, YouGov gave 58% to remain versus 31% to leave. And what happened in the end? Exactly. We all know how that story ended. Because in politics, and even more so in times of a crisis, a simple twist in the script changes everything. And Canada's crisis is not just any crisis. If tariffs remain in place, the independence movement in Alberta will have endless fuel for the flames. And will those tariffs remain in place? Everything suggests that they will.
We have all the cards. Trump says he is ending Canada trade talks.
Meanwhile, everything indicates that Mark Carney is willing to go to war with Donald Trump. The reason? He sees it as a political gift that he does not intend to pass up. Besides, let's be honest, few Albertans believe Carney's supposed shift on energy. And how can they not be suspicious? In recent years, he's done precisely the opposite of what he's now promising. To give you an idea, in 2020, he was appointed UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. Then, between 2021 and 2023, he served as Vice President at Brookfield Asset Management, where he led projects focused on the transition to a zero-emissions model. In other words, exactly what Alberta does not want to hear. So everything points to the same thing. The independence movement will continue to gain strength as political tensions and the economic effects of tariffs increase. But what if it really happens? What would happen if Alberta really did decide to break away from Canada? The first consequence would be a political earthquake, and the first to react would be Quebec. Let's not forget that this province has been seeking independence for decades. In 1980, they held their first referendum. The no vote won by a comfortable 60%. But in 1995, things were on the brink of disaster. The no vote won by a mere 0.58% difference. Since then, the Quebec independence movement has not died. It has simply been on hold, waiting for the right moment, and Alberta's independence would be the perfect spark. Keep in mind, it's not just Quebec that would raise its head. Saskatchewan also has scores to settle with Ottawa, with complaints very similar to those of Alberta. But the key point is that Alberta is not just any province, it's Canada's conservative stronghold, the land that sustains the Conservative Party election after election. We're talking about 34 seats in the House of Commons, the majority always in Conservative hands. If Alberta becomes independent, the Conservatives would lose almost a quarter of their MPs. The consequence, it would be almost impossible to form a government without Alberta. Canadian politics, already polarized, would be thrown off balance in the other direction. Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec, the most liberal regions, would come to concentrate power, and the left-leaning Liberal Party would have a clear path to becoming the sole arbiter of power in Ottawa. And then there would be the economic blow. Because Ottawa would lose its golden goose. And that brings us to the big question, what would happen to Alberta after that? The answer seems clear. It would look south. Because economic ties already exist, interests are aligned, and the ideological affinity with figures like Donald Trump is more than evident.
Make Alberta great again. In this Canadian province, separatists see Trump as an ally.
Nevertheless, take note, because here is one detail that could turn the whole board upside down. If Alberta separates from Canada, it loses its access to the Pacific Ocean, and for an economy that depends on oil, that would be like cutting off its oxygen supply. Strategic projects such as the Northern Gateway pipeline would automatically be shelved indefinitely. The consequence, Alberta would be trapped, with no real alternative for diversifying its export routes. In practice, it would depend almost entirely on the United States to sell its oil. So, becoming the 51st state, it may sound crazy, but it's not so far-fetched either. After all, the United States has a long history of annexations and territorial expansion, and for Alberta, joining its southern neighbor could provide security and stability, something that would be difficult to achieve on its own. Because let's be clear, building a new nation from scratch is not as straightforward as a Lego set. Instead, integrating into a large and powerful country may seem like a much more practical and tempting option. And this is where Donald Trump comes in. The former president has already publicly flirted with the idea, and it would not be unreasonable to think that he might try to force annexation. How? By means of economic pressure, or even a show of force if the political situation in Canada became unstable enough. Of course, before reaching that point, many stars would have to align. In fact, there are much more realistic intermediate scenarios. For example, the creation of a common market between Alberta and the United States. A kind of economic marriage without reaching complete political divorce. The point is that Alberta's future is full of unknowns. But for now, the question is over to you. Do you think Alberta will become independent? And if it does, will it become the 51st state? You can leave your answers down in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel, hit the little bell icon so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like the video, click like, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. See you soon.